Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping right into the ancient, iconic story of Gideon to uncover some incredibly profound psychological and philosophical lessons on fear, instinct, and human pride. Now, you might have heard of Gideon's army of 300 before. It's often treated as a classic underdog story. But as we unpack the source text today, we're going to see that this narrative is so much more than just ancient military strategy. It's actually a brilliant, almost aggressive dismantling of the human ego.
Okay, let's dive straight into this bizarre central question. How do you win a war by deliberately getting rid of 99% of your army? I mean, it's a completely paradoxical strategy, right? It defies absolutely all conventional military logic. But to understand why a commander, in this case God, would actually do this, we really have to look past the battlefield tactics and look at the ultimate goal behind the battle itself.
And that brings us to this specific verse, which really acts as the controlling thesis for everything that follows in the story. The text explicitly states the motive: "Lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying my own hand has saved me." The primary objective here isn't just winning a fight against an enemy nation. The real objective is destroying the illusion of human self-sufficiency. The idea was to make absolutely sure that the victory was unmistakably divine, leaving literally zero room for human boasting.
To really grasp the weight of this, let's set the scene with the massive enemy coalition that was waiting for them. We're talking about an overwhelming force of Midian, Amalek, and the people of the east. The text describes them as being like locusts in abundance, with camels without number. It's almost cartoonishly extreme imagery, but it's meant to convey this vast, terrifying horde that was just completely covering the valley floor.
Against this enormous, locust-like enemy, Gideon gathers his forces, starting with an already disproportionately small army of 32,000 men. By any normal standard, he's already severely outnumbered. But, looking at this deeply disadvantaged army, the message from above is essentially, actually, you have too many.
So the first of two really bizarre tests is initiated. The instruction is given to let anyone who is afraid just go ahead and go home. And instantly, 22,000 men pack up and leave. Just like that, the army is slashed down to just 10,000 men. Now, you'd think that would be enough of a handicap, right? 10,000 men against a countless horde? But incredibly, it's still not. The instruction comes down that there are still too many. And then comes this dramatic, jaw-dropping drop to a deliberately absurd force of just 300 men. To put that into perspective, that represents a mere 0.94%, literally a tiny fraction of a percent of the original force. This progression right here brilliantly illustrates the sheer absurdity of the math. We go from 32,000 to 10,000, all the way down to a final force of just 300. This progressive reduction results in a number so infinitesimally small that taking human credit for the impending victory becomes literally impossible. Think about it. If they won with 10,000, they could still say, well, we were outnumbered, but we fought fiercely. But with 300 against locusts, that explanation becomes utterly ridiculous. Now, this explains exactly why the army was reduced, but it doesn't explain why these particular 300 men were chosen.
Let's look a little closer at how they were actually selected. The first test dismisses 22,000 men simply because they're afraid. Now, this isn't totally random. This move actually aligns perfectly with established Israelite military law from the book of Deuteronomy, which states that a faint-hearted man should go home so his fear doesn't infect the morale of his fellow soldiers. So, practical, established rules of warfare are actually being honored here.
So the crucial point to catch here is that fear itself isn't being condemned to some kind of moral failing. The fascinating irony is that Gideon himself was terrified. Just a few verses later in the text, his own fear is openly acknowledged. But he's still used for the task. Why? Because courage in this specific context is defined as obedience that refuses to let fear become the ultimate authority over your actions. The 22,000 who left weren't necessarily bad people. They just weren't the right fit for this specific assignment because they let their fear dictate their departure.
This linguistic detail perfectly sets up the second test. The remaining 10,000 men are brought down to the water to be tested, but the Hebrew verb used here for test is saraf. It's a word specifically associated with smelting, refining, and purifying metal like gold or silver. This imagery is used to show this isn't just about counting soldiers to hit an arbitrary quota. This is an intense, highly intentional refining process.
And this brings us to a profound psychological shift. You see, the first test was public. Raise your hand and leave if you're afraid. But the second test shifts aggressively from public bravery to private, unguarded instinct. The instruction is to simply watch how these tired, thirsty men drink water. It asks this incredible question: what do you do when nobody is watching? What do you do when you are simply satisfying a basic, ordinary physical need? Consider the stark contrast in their physical postures during this ordinary moment. The vast majority, 9,700 men, sank entirely to their knees to drink. The Hebrew word is kra, meaning to bow down or prostrate oneself. But a tiny fraction, just 300 men, remained upright and brought the water up to their mouths with their hands, lapping it. The narrative repeatedly emphasizes this physical posture. One massive group goes completely down, while the other tiny group remains standing.
So, why the 300 who stayed upright? Conventional military theory suggests what's called the vigilance theory. And honestly, it makes total sense, right? The 300 upright men were simply more tactically alert to their surroundings. They kept their eyes on the horizon while drinking, whereas the kneelers just buried their faces in the water. It's a highly logical explanation, though it is incredibly important to note that the biblical text deliberately refuses to explicitly confirm this logic. The text never actually explains why lapping was better.
However, traditional Jewish interpretation, specifically from scholars like Rashi, offers a really fascinating alternative. This interpretation suggests the kneeling men were instinctively repeating their learned muscle memory of bowing before idols, like the false god Baal. Remember, there was a massive worship problem happening at this time. So the thought is that when these men went to drink, their bodies just automatically assumed the posture of idolatrous worship they were so accustomed to. The 300 were the ones who hadn't trained their bodies to bow.
Regardless of whether you lean toward the tactical vigilance theory or the profound muscle memory interpretation, the takeaway here is absolutely staggering. This mundane water test evaluated their raw, ingrained instinct rather than their conscious self-presentation. I mean, the men didn't know they were being tested. They weren't trying to act brave or look holy. They were literally just thirsty. It perfectly captures how our true character isn't revealed on the public stage, but in what we instinctively do when something incredibly ordinary happens.
So, the 300 refined men are selected. And just to ensure that human pride is completely dismantled, this final force is equipped with the most absurd military arsenal imaginable. Trumpets, empty jars, and torches hidden inside those jars. Notably, they are entirely devoid of swords, spears, or shields. They are literally going up against a valley of locust-like enemies with clay pots and flashlights.
Stepping back for a second, this three-step progression reveals the divine strategy perfectly. First, reduce the human resources so much that the math is laughable. Second, remove any logical military explanations by giving them jars instead of weapons. And third, prove who the true deliverer is. The entire point was to force theological clarity. It wasn't their own strength, intelligence, or weaponry. A higher power was their ultimate savior.
But there is a remarkable epilogue to this story that brings it right back down to human reality. Later in the text, these 300 men are described as exhausted, yet pursuing. What's so beautifully poignant about this is that it proves these men weren't selected because they were superhuman elite warriors who never got tired. Not at all. They were selected because they kept obeying and moving forward, even when they were completely drained and hitting the absolute limits of their physical strength.
And this brings us to a really powerful realization for our own lives. We so often pray for more resources, more strength, more money, more help. But this story forces us to realize that sometimes our greatest obstacle to experiencing true power or help isn't our weakness. The hidden danger is actually having so many resources, so much talent, and so many safety nets that we end up relying completely on ourselves and blindly attributing all our success to our own hands. As we apply the insights from this explainer, we really have to ask ourselves some tough questions. What is your $32,000? Seriously, what are the resources, the backup plans, or the safety nets you're depending upon that might actually be getting in the way of a deeper trust or a greater purpose? What would happen if those were stripped away? Would you panic, or would you look for the deeper lesson? We also have to deeply examine our own posture, just like those men at the water. What has your life unconsciously learned to bow before? When the pressure is off, when nobody is watching, and you're just satisfying ordinary needs, what habits of comfort, success, or control do you instinctively kneel to? We don't just show our devotion with our words, we show it with our ingrained habits and instincts.
If you find yourself in a season right now with closed doors, vanishing resources, or dwindling support, I want you to remember this absolutely crucial takeaway. Reduction is not rejection. The army wasn't reduced out of abandonment, it was reduced for a specific purpose. Having things stripped away isn't necessarily a punishment. Often, it's a refining preparation to make you truly available for what comes next.
So I want to leave you with a final thought from this incredible narrative. When you're facing an overwhelming obstacle and you feel like a fragile, broken jar in a difficult situation, what will your focus be? Will you constantly focus on your own inadequacy, begging to be made more capable and impressive? Or will you surrender your need for control, become entirely available, and simply let the light shine through? Give that some thought. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.